I promise that we're gonna start working on the project really soon. But for now, we need another reference lecture. So here we're gonna learn about styles and attributes and classes, and you will be able to keep all of the relevant tools here in one simple lecture so that you can reference all of them in the future. And some of these tools we will use later in a project, but it's impossible to create examples for all the functions and methods that I'm going to show you now. But they are still important. So let's go. And let's actually keep working on our cookies message banner here. Okay? So we're going to start by talking about styles. And we already set CSS styles before, but there are still some more things to learn. But first, let's go back to the basics. So to set a style on an element, we get the element, dot style, and then dot the property name. And remember, this will have to use the camel case version. So background color, and then a string with the value. And so here the color that I want is this one. So it's this kind of dark blue. So indeed, now this style nicely got applied to our element. And again, we didn't have to select it manually first because we already had it stored here in this message variable, which is this element that we created manually, right? We can also set the width, dot width, and remember that we have to write the CSS value exactly as we would do in CSS. And so we always have to include the unit. So in this case, I'm going to set it to a larger percentage so that it occupies this white gap here. And so now it got a little bit wider. Okay. And remember that these styles are actually set as inline styles. So styles set directly here in the DOM. So here in the style attribute of this element, we now have the background color and the width. Okay? And so these, again, are called inline styles. Now, you might think that we are able to also read styles using this. So using the style property. But let's see what's going to happen. So message.style, and let's say we want to get the height. So let's see what we get. And we get, well, basically nothing. And that's because using the style property like this here only works for inline styles that we set ourselves, also using the style property. So it's going to work, for example, for the background color. So let's copy this one. And now, here you actually get the background color. And again, because it is an inline style. So a style that we set manually ourselves. But we cannot get a style that is hidden inside of a class, or maybe that doesn't even exist. So for example here, let's say we wanted to get the color. So the color is defined in the style sheet, but if we try to log it here, then it's nowhere to be found. Now, we can still get the styles if we really want to. All we need to do is to use the getComputedStyle function. So that sounds a bit weird. And this is how it works. So getComputedStyle, and VS Code already suggests it here to me. And so here we need to pass in the element. So that's message. And now you see we get this huge object here. And so this contains all of the properties with all of the values. So this is huge. And so in practice, what we then do is to simply take a certain property like color from there. And so you see, this here is the color. Or let's say we wanted to height. And so this is the computed styles. So you see computed, which means that it's the real style as it appears here on the page. and even if we do not declare it in our CSS. So for example, the height, we didn't define ourselves, but the browser, of course, needed to calculate the height to display it. And so we can then get access to that value. And so you see it's this amount of pixels. So let's now say we wanted to increase the height of this message banner here by 40 pixels. So we could get this height and then simply add 40 to that. So let's create a variable called height. Or actually, let's do it directly. Let's say message.style.height should be equal to get computed style dot height plus 40, and then don't forget the unit. So 40 pixels. But now we're going to run into a problem, because as you see, this value here itself comes in pixels. So this here is a string, okay? Or actually all of this here, which is the same as we had before up here. So the result of this is a string. So here we're trying to add a number to a string, which of course is not going to work because, well, it has this pixel here. So let me show you that nothing here happened. But remember that we already learned about a nice function which can essentially take the number out of this string. So basically parse the number from here. And that is, remember, number.parse int or parse float. In this case, it's a floating point number. So let's use parse float here actually of this value. And then we need to specify also the number 10 in this function, remember? And so now it actually works. All right. So beautiful. It took that number here and only this number part without the pixels, added 40, and then added the pixel there. So that's a bit too much. So let's leave it like this. Okay, beautiful. So this get computed style can become in really handy. But now finally, let's also work with CSS custom properties, which we usually just call CSS variables. So what I mean here is these variables that we have here. So all of these. They are called custom properties, but again, they are more like variables. And the idea of CSS variables is, of course, very similar to the idea of variables in JavaScript. So this way, we can change a value in many places all over our CSS files by simply changing the value here. Now, if we can change the value here, so here in our CSS, then we can also change it right from JavaScript. So let's go back here. Or actually, let's first see where these properties are defined. So they are defined in the document root. And so in JavaScript, that is equivalent to the document. So basically the document element. All right. So document.document element, as we learned in the last video. Okay. So that is the root that we just saw in CSS. And now again, style. But now we can do set property. Okay. And then the name of our custom property. So let's say we want to change our primary color. So color primary, and then the value that we want to set it to. Let's say orange red. But of course, any color value would work here. And so you see that everywhere in our style where we used this color, which is a nice green color, now turned orange. So here, here, and really all over the place. All right. So with this, we can easily change the style of our page simply by setting one property. All right. So with custom properties, we cannot do it like this here, but instead we need to use set property. And then we pass in the name of the property and the value. And by the way, we can do the same for all properties. So we could also use set property to set the color or the background color or the width or really whatever we want. Okay, but usually it's just easier to simply do it like this. And that's why I always do that. Okay, so that's it for styles. Let's talk a little bit about attributes now. All right, so in HTML, just to remember, all of these are attributes. So this source, alt, even the class and the ID are simply attributes of this element. And so in JavaScript, we can, of course, access and change these different attributes. So let's actually select that logo that I just showed you. And the class of that is nav __ logo. So that's 2 underscores. And so now we can access some of these, let's say, default properties. So like the alt or the source attribute. So you see, here we get the alternative text, which is this alt, and then also the source. Now this looks a bit different than the one we have here, but more about that in a second. All right, so this works because on images, they are supposed to have the alt and the source attributes on them. And so if we specify them in HTML, then JavaScript will automatically create these properties on the object. Okay, but if we add some other property that is not a standard, then JavaScript will not automatically create a property on the object. So let's add, for example, designer and set it to Jonas. Okay, and so if we now tried to read logo.designer, that's not going to work. So you see, it's undefined. And again, that is because this is not a standard property that is expected to be on images. All right, just another one that works here, and that's a bit different than you might expect, is class name. So the class name of this element is just this class. And so you might think that it should be just class, but for historical reasons, it has to be class name, like this. Okay? So this is a non-standard, and that's why it doesn't work. Okay? At least it doesn't work like this. But of course, there is another way of reading this value from the DOM. It's just a little bit more difficult, but it's not a problem. So we can use getAttribute, and then here we can pass in the string designer, and that indeed, it returns to us Jonas. All right. Now, just as we can read these values for these attributes, we can also set them. For example, we can say logo.the alt text should be beautiful minimalist logo. And so now, let's check that out. And so indeed, that is the, well, that's actually the hero. So what I want is this. So yeah, it says beautiful minimalist logo now. All right. Oh, and by the way, there's also the opposite of getAttribute, which is setAttribute. So we can also say, for example, company, and then set it to Bankist. And so again, if we check it out now, then there should be this new attribute created right here. All right. Now, remember that I told you that the URL here, so basically, actually the source is different than what we have in the HTML. So this URL here of this image is basically the absolute URL, while what I have here, so this one here, is just the relative URL, so relative to the folder in which the index.html file is located. So that's completely different. And if we want to get just literally this URL that we have here, then we also have to use a get attribute. Okay? So get attribute and then src. So let me actually put these together so we can see the difference. And of course, I need to log this to the console as well. Okay, and so here you see the absolute version and then here the relative. So sometimes we really need the relative one, and then make sure you use this one. So get attribute. All right, so sometimes that's very important to keep in mind, and so that's why I showed it to you here. And the same is actually true for the href attribute on links. So where is the link? I think down here I have a Twitter link. So yeah, that's this one. So let's get this class here. So very quickly, just to show you, because on links, this is also sometimes very important. Query selector. So just so you can see what I mean here. So link.href and link.get attribute and then href again. Well, in this case, they're probably the same anyway. Yeah, because both of them were already absolute anyway. So in this case, that is not a big deal. But for example, in one of these links here in the top, there it might be relevant. Okay, so let's actually try that. So let's use this one. So the button show modal, so the nav link button, which here you see is simply this hash. So let's put that here. Oh, we're missing the dot. And now indeed you see that the href property is the absolute URL once again, while using get attribute simply returns the URL as I wrote it in the HTML. Okay. Finally, there is also a special type of attributes, and that's data attributes. So data. And data attributes are a special kind of attributes that start with the word data. So let's add one here to our image here. And let's say, so data version number equals 3.0. Okay. So again, it has to start with data. All right. And then dash and then whatever we want. Okay. And what's special about this is that now this attribute is at logo.dataset and then .version number. And here that's dataset. Don't know where that came from. Okay. And so here we use camel case, where here we have the dash. Okay. So just like property names, we need to transform this here into camel case. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay. So for these special attributes, they are always stored in the dataset object. And indeed, then down here we have that 3.0. So we use actually data attributes quite a lot when we work with the UI, especially when we need to store data in the user interface. So basically in the HTML code. And we will see how useful that can be throughout the rest of this project and of the course. Finally, to finish this here, just to make it complete, let's talk about classes. And even though at this point we actually already know all there is to know about classes. So you know that there is logo.classlist.add, and I will not do anything here. So there is add, remove, there is toggle, and there is contains. Okay, So these are the 4 that you really need to know. And here apparently we need to pass in something. Maybe the empty string works, but I'm not sure. Well, apparently it doesn't. Let's just write some name here. Just C for class. Okay. And keep in mind that you can also add multiple classes by passing in multiple values. And of course, here I'm just writing completely fake class names just to make a point. Okay. Now, just as we could read the class name here using the class name property, we could also use that to set a class. So we could do logo dot class name and then set that, well, let's say to Jonas. Okay. However, don't use this. Don't use. Okay. Because this will override all the existing classes, and also it allows us to only put one class on any element. All right. So again, only one class, and it will override whatever is already there, while these 4 methods here make it really nice to work with the classes by simply allowing us to add and remove classes based on their names without interfering with the classes that are already there. Just keep in mind that this one here is really called contains and not includes like it is called in arrays. So I hope that this serves as a nice reference for all these different ways of working with classes, attributes, and styles in JavaScript. But now in the next lecture, let's finally start to work on our project here.